Hello everyone, and yes, I had to restart the process of rebuilding a gearbox yet again. However, there is reason to this madness. It all started because I needed replacement parts for my selector shafts, and then I realized something. Now this gearbox had a longer gear ratio with regards to the 5th gear, which in turn can give me more range at top speed, so this results in better cruising speed. Now the 2 liter and the 2.8 liter engines share the same gearbox. The main difference is found in their internals, specifically the 2nd gear and the 5th gear, where for the 2 liter gearbox the ratios are higher. However, the differential compensates for this by having a much lower ratio, which in turn gives the end speed to be in a similar range when compared to that of the 2.8 liter. To those who would like to see the full disassembly of this type of gearbox, please check video number 11. So let's start with the boring part first, and that is a thorough cleaning of the internal parts of the gearbox. And since I don't own me any cleaning machines, and I don't like to use chemicals to clean, diesel mixed with some engine oil should do the trick. Now the reason for this mix is because while the diesel cleans, it will also dry up the internal bearings of each gear. So in order to play it safe, the oil is there to keep it stable. So while the part is being cleaned, the oil will still keep the bearings lubricated. And for those who are interested in these old school techniques, I used 1 part oil and 3 parts diesel. Okay, so these are the typical type of bearings found inside a gearbox. This is the main bearing that supports the prop shaft flange. This type of bearing supports the main shaft. The input shaft also requires the same type of bearing, which is placed on the external part of the input shaft, found on the opposite end of the gearbox. However, the input shaft also has an internal bearing, which is a nylon caged roller bearing. And this bearing is for the lay shaft, which sits on each end of the shaft. However, I managed to find this new type of bearing that is not sealed, but it has a guard to keep the flow of oil stable. This means that it takes time to be filled with oil and it takes time to be emptied. And most importantly, the guard acts as a barrier for any metal shards to enter the bearing. So in total, this kind of bearing is better than the original because it eliminates the risk of undergoing starvation of oil when the car exhibits braking, acceleration, going uphill or downhill. I know for the most part these are extreme measures because oil starvation in a gearbox is quite a rare thing, but I like to improve the efficiency of anything I can get my hands on. So those are the main type of bearings one will find in a generic manual gearbox for a longitudinal engine setup. Now this is the gearbox mounting, which is important to have it placed in the correct position like so, otherwise the weight of the gearbox and the vibration it will exhibit will tear it off, and you'll have a hanging gearbox which will ruin any other components which are attached to it. Here is an example of how the bearings fit when properly placed. So these are the main components of the gearbox laid out, and the main housing has the label of the gear ratios on it, and this was the first step for me to notice that I could use these ratios to my advantage. Okay, so here we arrived at the part where I had to come up with some mathematical calculations to verify just how much top speed I would gain and to see how much of an advantage it is by switching to these new ratios. Now for those interested, I used this formula as the basis of my calculations. So let's take into account the standard setup the car came out with. The gearbox for the 2.8 and the 2 liter come with ratios and parameters that you will see here. And these are the resulted graphs for each gear ratio accordingly. Finally, here are the top speed figures for each setup, and it is clear for everyone to see that the combined setup is more linear and gives a better output with increased efficiency of nearly 10% of the total result, 9.35 to be exact. I know it's not much, however, taking a bit from here and there and perfecting all the weak points will end up improving the car drastically while retaining its stock setup. In conclusion, the total cruising speed attained is that of 26 km per hour more than that of the manufacturer. So now that the mathematical part is over, it's time to move on to some fun stuff and get to see the reassembly of the gearbox. It's not an impossible task, but it sure isn't easy because calibration is key in this section. Now this is the assembly of the key components such as the main shaft, lay shaft and selector fork. And after everything is properly aligned, it is followed by assembling the rest of the parts. So now the next issue to tackle is to make a custom gasket that fits perfectly. To start with, I need to make me a template with some masking tape. Once I have the outline of the shape, it's time for me to place it on the gasket and cut around the markings. The markings are done by some sort of dye you can use which does not react to the gasket and you can easily wipe it off. Once the gasket is complete, the appropriate holes are punched in and the masking tape is removed. This process is repeated because it requires 2 gaskets, one on each side, and the total calculated shimming by means of the gasket is calculated to be at 0.6 mm. Therefore, in total, it's 0.3 mm on each side of the faces. Now that the gearbox is fully enclosed, the rest of the parts to be assembled are the external plates, linkage cover, and the bell housing, along with the placing of the clutch fork. Oh yes, the gear shift lever assembly also came without a gasket, so guess what? It's back to making me another one. You'll be amazed at how many parts the lever assembly comes with. Well, I guess that's the beauty of gearboxes. They are complicated in such a way that once they are assembled, they become very, very simple to operate.